Welcome to part 5 of Who Wrote the Letter to the Hebrews. I think that's what we're calling it. I've called it several things along the way. But anyway, this is part 5. Uh, so last time we were talking about Priscilla, specifically, about her place in the early church, her place in Rome. And we were talking about the things that she wrote in the epistle to the Hebrews. One of the most remarkable things is her learnedness of um, of the Old Testament, especially the prophets. Remember, we talked about her ministering to Apollos. Apollos he was a great teacher from Alexandria, Jewish teacher, and he was teaching everybody about how the prophets predict the Messiah. Well, when he lands in Ephesus, he encounters Priscilla and Aquila, and Priscilla becomes his teacher, showing him how Jesus is the fulfillment of the Hebrew prophets. Priscilla is very schooled in the prophets, so let's talk for a little bit about uh, how did she come to know the prophets so well. Remember, she is born and raised and educated in Rome, not exactly the place you would look for a Jewish shul to be found on every corner, nor would they have even let a girl or a young female to participate in the studies. But when we look at first century Judaism, it's a missionary faith. And when they are spreading all as they're scattering from Israel, for example, from Judea, they're carrying their faith with them, and they're not just carrying it in their homes and in their synagogues. They are, again, missionary. They are expanding. They are proselytizing, looking for converts. So somewhere along the way, Priscilla joined with the Jews of Rome. She became part of when she did, she became part of a very sizable community. Um, the Jews were numerous in Rome, as their catacombs tell us. We remember that the Jews and Christians with them, because they all were thought to be the same thing, were expelled by the Emperor Claudius from the city of Rome in the year 50 AD. Well, he dies in 54, and when he dies, his edict expires also. So a lot of them start making their way back to Rome after the year 54. Around that time, they were probably numbering about 25,000 in the city of Rome. But their population over the next 10 years grows to more like 50,000, especially during the reign of Nero. And we know, for example, that all in all, the city of Rome had 13 synagogues in it. That's pretty sizable stuff. The so the very first Christian converts in Rome came from the synagogues, and that was the sign that this was kind of a nonconformist branch of Judaism was being represented in Rome. Nonconformist in the sense that this is where the converts to Christianity is taking place. So the synagogues are allowing Christian Jewish speakers and leaders within the synagogues. These Jews who were especially populous in Rome and in Ephesus and apparently in Corinth was a group known as the Essenes. We haven't talked a whole lot about them, but the Essenes are the same, or at least closely related to, the Qumran community, which was located at the Dead Sea. It is the Qumran community who gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls, or at least stored them away in caves so that we could find them 2,000 years later. So the Essenes represent a different form of Judaism than what we would find among the Pharisees or the Sadducees or some of the others. This is yet another Jewish sect. And the Essenes were among the first to accept this new faith, as they were calling Christianity. The Jewish Christian migrants from Palestine and Syria, also, I mean, had in their ranks many, many former Essenes, and they became the missionaries, the proselytizers. In fact, we can read the epistle to the Hebrews and we can see in it a dialogue with Essene doctrine. It permeates the whole letter to the Hebrews. And so in Rome, Priscilla learned about this particular branch of Jewish faith. And that wound up influencing her Jewish attitude and her knowledge of Judaism. She was scholarly, she was determined. Priscilla set out to study the Hebrew scriptures then. She didn't know the Hebrew text. She didn't know Hebrew, apparently, but she did know Greek. So all she had was the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And again, that's the Bible, the Septuagint, that is being referenced in the epistle to the Hebrews. So that's what she knows, is the Greek version. And a lot of scholars had at one time said that the letter to the Hebrews was written by a Jewish theologian, but no, a Jewish theologian would have been quoting from the Torah or the Tanakh, the writings, the law, the writings, and the prophets. No, Hebrews is quoting from the Septuagint. And we can always tell that because there are certain transliterated words or translated words that don't come across the same in Greek as they are represented in Hebrew. For example, Pastor Elizabeth and I were talking about before we started that when Isaiah writes that, behold, we remember how it's quoted, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name. Okay. That's what the Greek says. The Hebrew says, behold, a young woman shall conceive and bear a son. There's a bit of a difference there. Now, while that young woman may indeed be a virgin, that's not specifically what the word says. But the Greeks translated it as parthenos, which meant virgin, and that's all it meant, was virgin. So we can tell the what translation she's using, whether Hebrew or Greek, from the words that she uses and that she uses in the writing. So if Priscilla is not trained in the Hebrew scriptures, if that's not part of her learning, and it wouldn't have been in Rome, remember, then how did she learn the Old Testament so thoroughly? Simply, she had the help of a book. And I don't mean the Hebrew Bible either. It was a book that was very popular at the time and remains so. In fact, we still have versions of it that grouped the scriptures, certain scriptures, by topics. Books like that were called testimonia. According to the theory, the testimonia theory, the author took quotations from this testimonia, this testimonia book, instead of hunting through all the scrolls and scrolls and scrolls of the Hebrew Bible or the Septuagint. In a book like a testimonia, there were verses gathered together about the Messiah that had been collected from the many books of the Bible, collected them all into one place. So instead of having to look through all the text of Jeremiah, all the text of Isaiah, all the text of all the rest of them, she simply could use this testimonia and find, here's all the things that are written about the Messiah. And she could use that then. There have been, it's very useful for research and for teaching. With the internet, it's like the internet is one big testimonia. To find a hardbound book like that, we don't use that quite so much anymore. But still, you can often find think about in our hymnals that you can look in the hymnal and look for something about Advent. and it lists all the Advent hymns that we sing, or Easter, or anything like that. It's along the same lines. So this testimonia would have all these things bound together and made it very easy for somebody to go, okay, I can quote this, I can quote that one, I can quote this other one. And there have been a lot of books like that. Even one of the Dead Sea Scrolls was called, they've listed it as 4Q Testimonia, simply 4 being the number of the cave, Q being Qumran. So it's the 4th Qumran cave, the Testimonia that they found there. It's a document just like that. So the construction of the epistle to the Hebrews, the theological construction, the references to the Hebrew Bible and to the prophets especially, was all very well within Priscilla's capability. But how could a proselyte have written the epistle to the Hebrews? Though she's at home in the world of the Jewish faith, I think that Priscilla need not have been Jewish by birth, or at least let's say the author of Hebrews need not have been Jewish by birth. Priscilla knew enough about Judaism to instruct Apollos, we know that for sure, who was a learned Jew from the great learning center of Alexandria. She was able to teach him in the scripture of his own faith. So Jewish birth or not, Priscilla was eminently qualified to write Hebrews, and to write that the passage there in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1, which describes the faith of our forebears. So she's talking about forebears not being her biological antecedents, but rather those who went in the faith before us. But in the apostles, like we talked about, there's also, I mean, in the epistle, there's evidence of this Roman upbringing. The author, for example, says that the Jewish food laws were spiritually ineffective for those who were led by them. That phrase, referring to those who follow or once followed them, is that it seems that the author never did so herself, that she was not born into and bound by the Jewish food laws. And so as a proselyte, then she can say, yeah, okay, all that that food stuff, what good did it do you? You know, it's almost like Edwin Starr asking about war. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Good God, y'all. Sorry, I had to finish the line. So, in fact, so she never seems to have followed those teachings herself. In fact, she calls them strange teachings that Hebrew Christians should avoid. Strange teachings. Strange to who? Well, she's writing to Hebrews, for example. I mean, or remember. So, you know, to say strange teachings, they're probably going, what are you talking about? It's not strange. We know all about that. No, the customs are strange to her, strange to the author, saying, wow, we, you know, and then of course to hear the gospel that you can eat anything you want to, and, you know, don't call unclean what I've called clean, it becomes doubly strange for her then, I think. Another clue is her discussion, and we mentioned this earlier, about parental discipline. And we talked about this just for a little bit last week when Pastor was asking about what are we going to talk about this week. I spoke too long about this part, but I'm going to give it to you again. The whole idea of parental discipline in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 through 11, who is likely to compare the discipline of our parents with the chastisement of God that we see in verse 9? Roman fathers were strict, and she is writing about, you know, the kindness of the parent and trying to do the right thing. And it's all very sweet and all very, all very patient. Roman fathers, not so much. The Roman fathers, they were called the pater familias. They were the father of the family. And they truly had the power of life and death. If a child displeased the father or shamed the father could kill that member of the family and never have to answer for it. That was the power of the pater familias. In Rome, they called it the patria potestas, the father's authority. And it was clearly an awful matter. There was just no rebelling against the power of the father in the Roman family. And all this applied to the girls as well as to the boys. In Hebrews 12 and 11, it reads, "For a moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. Later, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." Yeah, that's not a Jewish father who's writing that. That's not a Jewish parent at all who would write something like that. This talking about it's painful. It is, but eventually it's going to lead you to the right place, that peaceful fruit of righteousness for those who've been trained by it. It's a strict verbiage that she's using there. But look at that phrase, those who have been trained by it. You get the feeling that the author is writing from some experience there. In Hebrews, in Psalms 103, verse 13, it says, "As the father pities his children, so the Lord pities those who fear him." Nice. Not Roman. The Romans would go, "Yeah, do what I say or I kill you." And so there's no pity from the father. It's doing what you're told. So it's not a Jew who is writing this description of parental discipline. Rather, it is a Roman. Along the same lines, only in Rome were pastors characteristically referred to as leaders or rulers. The other churches, the Jewish churches, I should say, the churches from Judea and Asia Minor, didn't use that verbiage. Even in Corinth and Ephesus, two great Greek cities, you don't see rulers and leaders being used. That's a Roman phrase to refer to a pastoral leader. And yet that noun, ruler and leader, it appears in the 13th chapter of Hebrews three times. Three times that specific word is used in verses 7, 17, and 24. So without going into too much more detail, we can say with great confidence that whoever wrote Hebrews was a Roman, or at least a long-term resident of Rome. So all the while talking about Priscilla, Aquila, God bless him, lingers kind of quietly and peacefully in the background, making his tents, paying the bills. But in every respect of their work for Christ, we see Priscilla and Aquila in complete agreement. Now, I think it's only fair that finally the husband gets put in the background and has to shut up while the wife becomes the leader and the talker in the group. But he was as hospitable as she, allowing Apollos to come into the house, allowing Paul to come into their house, not only in Ephesus, but in Corinth also. Together, they shared in the rescuing of Paul, that Paul refers to as risking their necks for him. These two are in complete agreement. And as they were alluded to in Romans 16, verse 3 and 4, they both agreed, like I said, to open their home and not only to have boarders like Paul or Apollos or others, but to have people in who to teach them and to care for them. It became the church meeting house. So when Priscilla wrote the epistles to the Hebrews, and now we can call her the prime suspect. Aquila would fill in the details that she wanted to know from his own solid acquaintance with Scripture. Um, but make no mistake, she's the brains of the family. I'm not saying he's uneducated, but she is supremely educated. She is phenomenal. She represents maybe the finest theologian of the New Testament, and I know that upsets followers of Paul and James and Apollos and Cephas, Peter, and the rest of them. But wow, what a mind! And what you know, there are certain books I like to read over and over again. I mean, novels or even some history books, simply because I like the way the author tells the story. Well, Hebrews is just that. That it's the same gospel you're going to read from Paul, the same theology you're going to read from Paul, but man, she tells it so much better than Paul does. And again, like we surmised last week, maybe she even edited some of Paul's letters just to, polish it up a little bit. Well, Priscilla's family was actually above Aquila's family socially. Um, was there an intellectual and educational dissimilarity between the two? Well, history seems to tell us that both Aquila and Priscilla possessed a very high degree of the gifts of wisdom and knowledge. Both were thoroughly educated in Pauline teaching, and why not? They had spent so much time with him, they became uh, very familiar with the vocabulary as well as the theology of Paul. Um, and more than that, even Aquila's occupation of tent maker was compatible with even the highest education. Doesn't seem like that. It would seem the other way, that any idiot can make a sorry any idiot can make a tent, right? Well, no. The tent, because tents didn't just refer to something you put on a pole and people would gather under and have a party. Tent makers also made sails, and the making of sails for ships was incredibly detailed work because of just the way that the wind could shear fabric. Uh, so there's a whole lot of, there's got to be some reasonable education in physics and even what am I trying to think of? The like in textiles as well. But to own your own business is also, for anybody, requires some good bit of training. Well, um, we and remember, Paul also worked with him as a tent maker when they were in Ephesus and again in Corinth. But look at his name, Aquila. Well, it's the Latin word that means eagle. Now, he wasn't a Roman, because we know he came from Pontus in Asia Minor near the Black Sea. And so he's not a Roman, but he carries a rather illustrious name of a Roman. Maybe he adopted the name because it was prominent, but maybe there's a different explanation. It may be an early instance of a practice that later became common among Jews. That is, that Jews would adopt names of animals when they settled among the Gentiles. Names like wolf, usually spelled Wolffe, or simply like we spell the animal. There was also bar, which meant bear. There was Hirsch, that meant stag. There was, I don't know, or Adler. Adler was a German name, and Adler is the German word for eagle, same as Aquila. So there's lots of examples of something like that. So a lot of the Jewish names that we know now are actually the names of animals from the place where they live. So what about Aquila then? Was he a freedman who had been part of the family of who had been owned by the family of Pudens. Remember, we talked about him last week. That's one of the theories, anyway. So, what can we say about his status as a freed slave, if that was the case? Statistically, there is a very good chance, in fact, a 1 in 3 chance that that he was once a slave. By the end of the 3rd century AD, Rome had 400,000 slaves in it. That was a third of the city's population. So yeah, pretty good chance for Aquila to have been at one time a slave. And for Aquila, the odds are probably even higher than that, because again, coming from Pontus on the Black Sea, he was a foreigner in Rome, like most slaves were. Many of those had been seized during the wars of foreign conquest, brought back to Rome, which is why there were so many Jews there. They didn't migrate; they were brought there, thanks to the invasions of Pompey and later. That was like in the 1st century BC. So, what did slaves do there? Well, not all of them were farm laborers or household workers. A lot of those educated slaves became the tutors of the noble families or the slave owning families' children. They were secretaries, they were librarians, they were doctors, even physicians. And so we can't think of them like we think of the horrors of African slaves in America. The status of the slaves eventually and gradually was elevated, especially in the 1st century. They were given, many of them, given utmost respect and consideration. Some slaves were like members of the families who owned them. And when we think of slaves in Rome, again, don't think about the horror of American slavery, African slavery. Harnack said that one of the 2 most powerful men in Rome at the time of the Emperor Claudius was his private secretary named Narcissus. And Narcissus was a slave who was granted his freedom. And he's considered the 2nd most powerful man in Rome. A slave, and then a former slave. A law enacted in 18 BC, pardon me, restricted but didn't ban the marriage of freedmen into senatorial families. And remember, if Priscilla, as we suspect, is a member of the Pudens family, the Acilii Glabrionis family, then she's a member of the senatorial family. So is she going to get to, is the law going to allow her? I think Chuck raised that question a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, she could, because it was, let me get this right. The law held that a child of a senator or a consul, or his grandchild, or his great-grandchild through male descent could not marry an ex-slave. So, through male descent. So Priscilla could have married a free man if her maternal grandfather, even if he had been a consul, and remember, he's one of the Glabriones, but not if her paternal grandfather had been. Well, lucky for Aquila, it was not her paternal grandfather who was a consul and a senator. It was her maternal forebears. But slavery itself didn't carry a stigma in the 1st century in Rome. It was considered a kind of a commonplace misfortune. It could be overcome by intelligence, by diligence, hard work, period. A slave could win respect as well as winning his or her own freedom. And Aquila did not lack any social acceptability as a Jew either. Mixed marriages in that time, and like that of Timothy's parents, were not really out of the ordinary, not exceptional at all. In the ancient world, Jews often married into leading families. So Aquila's status was no bar to, number one, his church responsibilities that he shared with Priscilla as being a leader of a church. In fact, the early church is really a model of equal rights, egalitarianism. The early church could accept anybody, male, female, slave. Well, think of Paul's writings. There is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, bond nor free. Everyone was accepted. And that was even true in church leadership, even though that would horribly change within 100 years. Um, so slaves could be teachers and high officials in the congregation, um, as well as in the government or in the household. And they often were. Aquila and Priscilla could teach and preach no matter who they were, and the only thing that was necessary was ability and, well, frankly, charisma. And they apparently had bucket loads of both of those things. Now, in Corinth, Priscilla worked alongside Paul and Aquila at tent making. Their trade didn't, like I said, didn't mean there was no higher education. In fact, it really kind of required a higher education. So, well, what did Priscilla then do in tent making? Was she out there, sewing the fabric with them? Well, sure, she helped to weave the tent cloth, to be sure. At home, she may have supervised the servants who were doing the weaving, but she also had to learn it. And actually, weaving was a part of every household. Even in wealthy homes, the families did their own weaving. Of course, we think of it as homespun. And homespun was still being manufactured in noble Roman homes in the first century. Matter of fact, the Emperor Augustus was said that he liked wearing homespun around the house, and he made his own family do the weaving. He didn't want any of this, outside of the neighborhood stuff. So tent making gave Aquila and Priscilla not only security, but a good bit of freedom of movement too. Like Paul, they were able to relocate by choice or by necessity, like having to flee Rome or be thrown out of Rome with the edict of expulsion from Claudius, or running from danger. That allowed them to move at will. So in Corinth, we see them making sails for ships. In Ephesus, they made luxurious tents and marquees, and it was actually good money. In Ephesus, especially, the work for them was plentiful. It was a good place for Aquila and Priscilla to settle down, to build up the church. And as a matter of fact, they were there for a long time. And in 65 or 66 AD, it would be their concern for the church in Ephesus that would cause Priscilla to write the epistle to the Hebrews. Obviously, I'm thinking that the destination was Ephesus. So a guy named Charles Caleb Colton, fortunately, all starting with C, otherwise you got trouble with your monogram. He wrote, he says, the greatest friend of truth is time. Well, it's taken a long time. The truth about Priscilla and her family was literally dug out of the earth, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, but it took 18 or 19 centuries for it to get to us. Harnack's theory about Priscilla was in 1900, a long, long time after the writing of the epistle. So where does Priscilla stand now? Well, she has her star pupil, Apollos, who can prove from Scripture that Jesus is the Messiah. This is one of the underlying themes of the letter to the Hebrews. And unlike her student, however, she was converted by one who had seen and heard Jesus. She knows Philo, who will influence her vocabulary and terminology in the epistle to the Hebrews. At last, she's reunited with her family in the, upper stratus of the Roman society. She's grounded in literature, in philosophy, and in rhetoric. She's eloquent like Apollos. She's a teacher. She's a leader. She's fervent in spirit like Apollos. And she's given up luxury and noble status in order to proclaim the gospel. Those traits, will all be mirrored in the epistle to the Hebrews. Priscilla standing there in Timothy's circle as a corollary of her close relationship with Paul. Her marriage to Aquila is reasonable and absolutely, by all indications, just adoring of each other. I mean, the two of them, I used the word, I think in the first week, they are inseparable. You don't see one name mentioned without the other one. I kind of like that. And the two of them share a ministry in Rome, in Corinth, in Ephesus. And there, sitting on her desk, we can imagine, is a testimonia, and it's lying right beside the Greek Septuagint. So Priscilla is ready to write her letter, and the destination of that letter is Ephesus. Beyond any reasonable doubt, the destination is Ephesus. It's the capital of the Roman province of Asia. If we were able to using our detective story terminology, if we were able to stake out the city of Ephesus, we can see how the city really meets all the conditions for being the home of the first recipients of the letter to the Hebrews. No other city meets all the conditions that are called for, stated in the letter to the Hebrews. All signs point to Ephesus, and it will not take us to Jerusalem or Alexandria or Antioch or Corinth or even Rome. Ruth Hoppen, the one we mentioned about who wrote the great book, Priscilla's Letter, she compiled a fact comparison chart for what churches looked like in the year 65 AD. When we look at the comparisons of the people of the city, the people of the church, the mode of conversion as recorded in Hebrews, the organization and leadership of the church, the spiritual condition of the church, the persecution encountered by Christians there, we slowly but inexorably moved to the conclusion that Ephesus, not Jerusalem, not Alexandria, not Antioch, not Corinth, and not even Rome, is the destination for Priscilla's letter. So who are the readers? Who are the people in Ephesus who are doing the reading? In the 1800s, a writer named E.M. Rote blew past the title of the letter, blew past the subject matter of the letter to propose in 1836 that Hebrews was addressed mainly to Gentiles or simply to all Christians. It was like a general letter, a general epistle, forgetting that it had always been called the epistle to the Hebrews. Well, don't let facts stand in the way of a good story. But in the 1950s came the discovery and the publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which led to the rather startling discovery that Hebrews was written, the letter to the Hebrews, was written in the context of Qumran or Essene thinking, theology. Of all the New Testament writing, it's Hebrews that gives us the most comprehensive reply to certain doctrines of the Qumran sect of the Essenes. With the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, The Essenes, as a sect within contemporary Judaism of the first century, with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, comes into rather sharp focus. We're able to see exactly what these people thought, how they thought, and what their teachings were looked like, what their theology was. Since most of the scrolls from the Dead Sea are from the first century BC and the early first century AD, all right, the group that wrote them and copied them were the ones who stood there on the threshold of the emergence of Christianity. This winds up being they're the transitional bunch. They're the bridge between the ancient world of Hebrew Bible Judaism and what was to come. Their theology prepared them for just such things. Reading one of their scrolls like the war of the children of darkness with the children of light. I got that backwards. The war of the children of light with the children of darkness is not a struggle of good and evil. That's not it at all. It's talking about the struggle between the true believers and those who have compromised, I guess we'll say. And Hebrews addresses that doctrine. Three writers stand out from the first century who detailed the importance of the Essenes. The first one is a guy named Flavius Josephus, the historian. He wrote the books, The Jewish War, and another one called Antiquities of the Jews. Then there was Philo of Alexandria, that you've heard me mention a good bit, philosopher, heir apparent to Plato, and definitely gave us language that helped in our developing theology. And then the third one was a guy named Pliny the Elder, who wrote a book called Natural History. Philo, like Josephus and Pliny, admired the Essenes. In fact, he considered them to be exemplars of the thesis of his book called Every Good Man is Free. That's a great book. Every good person is free. And he talks about, you know what, if your heart is good, if your heart follows after righteousness, it doesn't matter what happens to your body. And that was something that really ministered to the early church, because they found themselves enslaved so much. And again, we're not talking about the horrific life of a slave like we think about, in our own history, but still, as they say, a gilded cage is still a cage. But if you're a good man, then, and you know what, Luther actually would pick up on that idea with his book called The Freedom of the Christian. When you read his book, you realize, hey, Luther did him a little bit of reading in Philo, which is kind of fun and not at least the least unexpected. We know that the readers of the letter to the Hebrews were former Essenes, because there's kind of four themes that jump out that are common to Hebrews and the Essene teachings. And that is the themes of the people of the covenant and the high priest, regarding sacrifice and atonement. Angels were mentioned in both, and the Messiah. So the letter going from Priscilla to Ephesus, but where did she write it? Where was, what's the postmark on that letter? Well, when we ask where the letter was written, we first need to look at the date of the letter. We'll come to the conclusion that the letter was written about the year 65, and the postmark is Rome. So in 65, why was Priscilla in Rome? I mean, by that time, she and Aquila had left Rome before and had gone on to Corinth and spent a good bit of time there, a couple of years, then on to Ephesus and spent a great deal of time. Why did she go back to Rome? Why would any Christian want to go back to Rome, where You know, you had things like Nero. Well, pardon me. So she's writing to the Christians in Ephesus. She's in Rome during the Neronian persecution. And apparently, Paul had asked for Timothy to come to him, to Rome. And Timothy was in Ephesus. And apparently, Priscilla and Aquila who were in Ephesus, like I said, they read the letter. And when Timothy set out for Rome, they went with him. Why would they go? It's a simple answer. And sometimes we look for very complicated, very unsatisfactory answers by trying to find this reason or that reason, or God told him to do this, or somebody else did some other thing. When in fact, it was friendship. It was love. That's all. There is no other explanation forthcoming and no other explanation necessary. It was love that was the decisive part of their decision to go and see Rome and to accompany their friend Timothy. That friendship is what led to the affinity between the letter to the Hebrews and all of Paul's letters. We see the convergences of between the writings of Paul and the epistle to the Hebrews, and they are numerous convergences. Why would a brilliant and independent thinker like Priscilla echo so many of Paul's ideas and even some of his imagery? Well, again, it's a simple answer. These two sat together over the table, around the fire, huddled on ships. They spent so much time together. And I can imagine, and I say this with a great deal of confidence, that she influenced him as much as he influenced her. I mean, the great imagery that Paul winds up coming up with, Paul's just not that creative. She is. And I think about like in some of Paul's military terminology, for example, and it's such precise language that I think that here's this woman, Priscilla, whose family had been consuls, which made them commanders of the military. That language was second nature to her. So these, the time they spent talking and ironing out theology and ironing out the imagery and ironing out the vocabulary and just crafting the theology of the early church, it comes from all that time spent with them being so hospitable to Paul, both in Corinth and in Ephesus, that they had all these long discussions. But again, why go to Rome? Well, Paul is imprisoned in Rome. Priscilla had a compelling reason to go because she wanted to see him, wanted to be with him. And also, remember, her relative, Acilius Glabrio, was the consul in the year 54. And there were several other of the Acilian family who were senators, had been consuls in the first century, and consuls have the power to release and free prisoners and slaves. Well, why wouldn't you want to go ask Uncle Acilio to do your friend a solid, cut him loose? If anybody could help through high office or influence, it had to be Priscilla's family. And they would, remember, Christians would come to Paul's aid, if at all possible. So we see Priscilla back in her native city, visiting Paul in prison, reuniting with Pudens and her other relatives, saddened by the suffering of the Roman Christians, but always mindful of her congregation back in Ephesus, where the danger lurking there was a little more subtle than what was going on in Rome. Right at that moment in Ephesus, it was more apathy that was the problem. It's not that they were being persecuted, but they were certainly being ignored. The real problem was what was going on inside the church, the apostasy, the falling away from the truth that she was so concerned with. Um, in her letter, Priscilla hints at the fierce trials that were endured by the Christians in Rome. And she reminded the Ephesians that they had not yet, remember, had not yet died for their faith. Look in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 4. At this time, Timothy had already been taken into custody, but he was soon to be released and would return to Ephesus, according to Hebrews 13:20, 23. So Timothy then would actually go back to Ephesus and become the first bishop there. Okay, don't think of bishop like we think of bishops today. The bishops of that time, the episkopos, was basically the pastor of the church. There would be outlying churches within a city, and this bishop would go and visit those other churches as well. So it's not like we think of today that a bishop is over many different other parishes and pastors. No, this was basically a pastor who had several. Well, think of Pastor Elizabeth. She's got three. She could have been a bishop in the early church. She's got three churches under her leadership. So yeah, that was what we were talking about then. The whole idea of having a bishop over many other, like a regional bishop, was, well, it wasn't necessary at that time because the growth was so small. So Priscilla and Aquila wind up going back with Timothy back to Ephesus, but even then, eventually they returned to Rome. And that's where they met their martyrdom. We have so few details, but that's where they were finally put to death. We don't know the year because Rome was in a state of catastrophe during the latter part of the first century. But we know that they were buried there. Had they been martyred someplace else, probably not much chance of their bodies being sent all the way back to Rome. Kind of doubt that. But having died in Rome, then the family, because they're a Christian family, would have taken possession of their bodies and buried them exactly where we know they were buried. In remember, we talked about that last week, the cemetery of Priscilla. I see you yawning, Chuck. So there they are. If we were to give a final summary of Priscilla, and we look back at the rather long list of church history figures who were named at one time or other as a possible writer of the epistle to the Hebrews, it took what, 1835 years before Harnack would present this most compelling case for Priscilla. And even though Harnack enjoys a measure of support during his own time, his hypothesis wound up being overshadowed by the criticism of course, church leadership. Because when he's writing that, women are not allowed in the ministry. Women are not allowed to. And so to think of having Priscilla as the author of one of the most remarkable books of the Bible, it was unthinkable to them. Well, Harnack wound up still winning the day. As time went on, people began to rediscover. And as we discovered, like I said, the Dead Sea Scrolls, wait a minute, now we see something else. Again, time is the best friend of truth. Eventually, as they always say, truth will come out. So today, these days, we're again challenged to weigh the evidence for Priscilla. Was she a close friend of Paul? Yes. Was she learned and cultured like her student Apollos? Yes. Did Apollos preach on the messiahship of Jesus, the main theme of the letter to the Hebrews, following after her instruction? Yes. Did she have a ministry in Ephesus, the destination of the letter? Yes. Did she have a connection at Rome, where the letter was known and copied and esteemed even, and where the unique liturgy in enshrining Melchizedek as a high priest, all that's in the epistle? Yes. Have we found plenty good example upon example upon example of a feminine outlook in the epistle? Yes. Have we found, again, example upon example of the inclusion of women among the heroes of faith? Yes. Is there anyone else in Paul's circle among the outstanding leaders of the early church who meets all of these qualifications? Yes, Priscilla. She stands alone in all the field of contenders. She was the learned teacher of Paul. She was the dedicated leader of congregations. She was a famous evangelist in the apostolic church, and with her husband Aquila were close companions of Paul. She is our prime suspect with the means, the motive, and the opportunity, as they say in court cases. At least that's what I learned from Law and Order. We know that the author was not Paul, whose blunt speech doesn't match the letter writing artistry and refinement of the letter to the Hebrews. It was not Apollos, whose eloquence and knowledge of Scripture lends only slight credibility to his authorship, but who squared off against Paul, staking out territories for places that takes him far from the scene of the writing. No, Apollos could not be the author of Hebrews. It wasn't Barnabas, whose name would not have been lost, as hers appears to have been. Besides, he died before the letter was ever written. So Apollos is out. It wasn't Philip the deacon. It wasn't Zenas the lawyer. It wasn't any other hapless person you can name in the early church history. No, it was Priscilla, not a shadowy figure, fleeing the limelight, but with so little impact in the apostolic churches to elude any mention of Scripture. Nope, Priscilla, no doubt about it, is, at least in my mind, and you can be wrong if you want and think otherwise, Priscilla is our author to the Hebrews. And, oh, that was right on an hour. Pretty good. So that's where we'll call it. I know that we only dealt askance at some of the theology, but mostly because we wanted to look at Priscilla and present her and our case for her. So there you have it.
Thank you, Travis. Some of the things that came, well, one, thank you for this series. And as you were explaining more, I mean, there are so many questions that come up of like, oh, how is it Priscilla? And then going to the Roman history in it. So yeah, we needed that time to absorb those people. A couple of things that came to mind though on the content of it. So thinking about Priscilla as convert to first Judaism and then to Christianity, and often it's those who convert to a religion, they're doing it for a reason, right? Like she's excited and diving into things, and it in some ways makes it more powerful for her to claim that legacy of those heroes of the faith for herself and for us too, right? Today, there's like that connection of that today. And I also was thinking about when you were talking about what was the biggest challenge to the Christians in Ephesus. It wasn't that immediate persecution that she was seeing in Rome, but it's that apathy. And there's a case for that today too, right? When we're in a Christian dominated nation, we are not persecuted.
Yes.
We sometimes hear from our siblings around the world who are in danger for their lives because of their Christian faith. But what urgency is there for us to live a Christian life and testimony? And so that sort of theme, I felt like that
Yes, and you hear so many Christians these days, in America anyway, talking about, oh, they persecuted me because they won't allow me to do this, and they won't allow me to trample on the rights of somebody else. They're persecuting my rights as a Christian. And you think about Priscilla writing, "You have not suffered yet unto blood. You don't know what you're talking about." And what you've got is, just like she was saying, you've got maybe indifference, but the real danger is what's going on inside the church. The apostasy inside the church, that's the danger. Our persecution isn't coming from outside. Our persecution is what the church is doing to the gospel during this time. And it's not pretty.
Yeah, and then a couple other questions I had, or when you were talking about, I really appreciate you driving home that slavery, as we hear in Rome at the time, and this goes then for scripture as a whole.
Yes.
Not like it is in our history, our closer history. And part of it, that a phrase that came to mind when you were sharing that, when Roman slaves could win their freedom, right? Because that's part of the narrative that sometimes gets told about in US history. Well, people were sometimes freed. But what I was hearing more about Roman slavery was they could and they did,
and
not
they did.
as the exception to the rule.
That's right.
But as a
let's be honest, gaining your freedom in America in 1840 came from escaping. It didn't come from merit. It didn't come from contribution. It didn't come from intelligence and from creativity. No, it came from fleeing it. That was not the case in Rome. Yeah.
Okay, and then my last one before we open it up to other questions is, you were started to talk about wisdom and charisma and other things, and my mind immediately went to D&D. So my desire is for you to do like character sheets for leaders in the New Testament.
Yeah.
I haven't Googled it yet. Maybe it exists out there for others of you, but like
I hope not.
Experience through different events, or anyway, I've been getting to know my own character sheet for the character I'm playing. And just those key words, I was like, oh yeah, what would Paul's character sheet look like compared to Priscilla's?
Well, okay, this lets you in on a little too much knowledge about me growing up. But when I was in college, we actually had character sheets, and everybody else would fill in they would debate, and Travis has there were some of them. Travis was like, oh, Travis's charisma is like 3. He's got, and others were like, no, he's a nice boy. He's, but yeah, so that was kind of a revealing thing too, to see what other people thought I had. And, intelligence was high, wisdom was low. Go figure. That's just not right. So, yeah, that brought down my charisma too, I'm sure, at least in dealing with this group.
All right, well, so before we open it to more Q&A, I'm going to have Travis explain what we're going to do next in a couple months' time. Does that sound good?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Pastor and I were talking about it, and we had a few possibilities. And I think what we've decided on is Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book, Life Together. Instead of doing another biblical book, we thought, let's take a theological book and look at it. And Bonhoeffer's Life Together was written while he was the teacher of the Finkenwalde seminary, which was an underground seminary in Nazi Germany. The Gestapo kept trying to close them, and they kept escaping the clutches of the Gestapo. But the whole idea of life together is, what does it mean to live in community? While he's thinking about living community in community as a seminary, the applications for us as a church are far-reaching, and it's a very, very short book. In fact, I think it's not quite his shortest book, but it's like 3rd from shortest. But Pastor Elizabeth has a link where you can actually find it, and but there is if you wanted to order it, there is a paperback version, which is sadly not very cheap. It's called, it's volume 5 of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer works. That one has all kinds of great textual notes and earlier versions of it before he edited them out. And so anyway, that's a more academic. But if you want just the text, then you can get it for free, right, Pastor?
Yep, I'll share the link out in my email on Monday, and it and in other reminders. And we are going to take time to read the book, and so we'll start up that next series on January 14th.
14th,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
And
January
actually,
14th.
as you were describing, because one thing I couldn't remember off the top of my head is when he had written it. So
Mhm.
thinking about, I mean, connecting it back with what we just talked about and heard tonight of
Right.
the letter to Ephesus, what is it, looking inward at our life together as Christian community, this is a really applicable text for us to
Oh, it is. Yeah.
and to bring to others. And I'm hoping that we're going to do a little bit more publicity with some other churches too, so we may have more joining us. But we'll
Cool.
plan to stay on Zoom at this time.
Excellent.
So with that, if you want, so yeah, I'll just say thank you again, Travis, and we'll continue
Thank you.
our conversations.